Alright, so today I wanted to share my top 10 reasons for keeping and breeding ball pythons. Now let me tell you, when it comes to breeding ball pythons, I'd say everyone has a slightly different reason for keeping and breeding ball pythons. It's kind of interesting. If you ask 10 different breeders, you might get 10 different answers as far as why they're breeding ball pythons. And I actually made a list of my top 10. The most important, number one, is that they're low maintenance animals, which is pretty amazing. If you're not familiar with ball pythons, it's kind of a shock when you first get your very first ball python. As a matter of fact, when I first got into snakes, it's kind of wild because you're thinking, all right, I actually eat 3 times a day and I feed my dogs 2 times a day, and then you get a ball python and everything changes. And a ball python will only eat once a week, maybe once a week if you're lucky. Sometimes they'll skip a week or two, and it's kind of crazy. When I first got my very first ball python, I was actually kind of peeking in the enclosure every couple days, and I was like, this is really weird that I don't have to feed this animal twice a day like I have to feed all my other animals. If you're not used to ball pythons or snakes in general, it can be kind of weird. As a matter of fact, if you actually get to the end of your first week and your ball python doesn't eat, sometimes you can get a little panic thinking, oh, my ball python hasn't eaten for a whole week. Now it's going on 2 weeks or maybe even 3 weeks without eating, which is completely normal for a ball python. I've actually seen ball pythons go for months and months without eating. It's perfectly normal, especially for breeding females, to go a really long time. And I'd say that kind of freaks out most of the new people into ball pythons, that they don't really have to eat that often. You know, hatchlings, I'd say usually with hatchlings you'd feed them maybe every 4 to 5 days, but with adult ball pythons like Bobby here around my neck, it's pretty incredible. He'll actually eat, I typically feed him about once a week, and he'll eat like a rodent every week, week after week. And then he'll get to the point where he just refuses the rodents, and he'll go on a fast for like a whole month, won't eat anything for a whole month. And people will actually comment in my videos and look at Bobby and say, hey, Bobby's looking kind of fat right now, which is kind of interesting because he hasn't eaten in a whole month, which is pretty amazing. It's almost like unbelievable that they're so low maintenance animals. And that is probably the number one reason that I keep and breed ball pythons, because you can actually go on a vacation for a few days and come back. It's no problem at all. Your snakes will survive, versus if you have dogs or cats or anything like that, you actually have to find someone to feed them, which is it's a completely different game with ball pythons. That is the number one reason that I keep and breed ball pythons. Number two, the real reason that I breed ball pythons is the joy of bringing new life into the world. And let me tell you, if you actually breed anything and you bring a new life into the world, it's pretty amazing just to experience the process of getting the eggs and incubating them, hatching them, and bringing new life into the world. And when I sell a ball python hatchling, it's almost like I'm selling a little bundle of joy. It's pretty awesome. I'd say probably the number 2 animal that I'd breed besides ball python is puppies. I absolutely love breeding dogs and puppies. I actually had 2 litters in my life, pretty much only did it twice. And the reason I don't breed puppies anymore is because it's an incredible amount of work. Well, let me tell you, if you're actually breeding puppies and you give a puppy away, that is definitely like giving away a bundle of joy, which is pretty much the same thing with the ball python. It's kind of cool. All right, number 3 is that they make wonderful pets and are very interactive. That's kind of the one thing I really like about ball pythons and any snake in general, is that they really like to be handled. If you can actually watch Bobby here, kind of hanging around my neck. You can see him in every single video I film with him every day, and it seems like he really enjoys to get out and just kind of hang around on my neck. It's almost like he's on a really big hot spot, like on a big tree, just kind of crawling around, and he never really tries to get away. He really enjoys coming out and being interactive. Versus some other animals, a lot of times you'll actually get like lizards or geckos or something like that, or a tortoise, where they're not really as interactive as like a hands-on species like a ball python. All right, number 4, the thing I really like about keeping and breeding ball pythons is that they have a simple diet. So a diet of rodents is 100% complete. You don't need supplements. You don't need to, I actually have a tortoise that I feed every single day or every other day. And early in the morning I'm there chopping lettuce and carrots and putting the calcium powder on. And let me tell you, that is a lot of work compared to a ball python where you just feed them once a week and you're done with it. And they just eat one thing. Rodents are 100% complete, which is pretty awesome. You don't have to worry about any supplements or anything like that. So number 5, I breed ball pythons because it acts as a lifeboat for the species. So this is kind of interesting. I've actually seen a lot of people that are really against keeping any type of animal. You see some of these groups out there, and they're kind of under the assumption that, all right, we should take all these animals and put them in the wild and let them do their own thing in the wild, which is kind of an interesting spin on keeping any type of an animal. And the way I really think about it is if you kind of know the backstory of the crested gecko, it's really interesting. Before 1994, we thought the crested gecko was actually an extinct species. As a matter of fact, for decades, we thought it was completely extinct. None existed at all. And then in 1994, they actually found a really small colony of crested geckos in the wild. They took some of those crested geckos, brought them into captivity, figured out the diet. We can actually, now they have like the powder diet that you just mix with water. It's really easy. You figured out how to breed them in captivity. And now when you go to the reptile shows, I'd say probably ball pythons are the most popular. And right behind the ball pythons, I would dare say the crested geckos are probably the most popular reptile in the industry, which is kind of crazy, going from extinct to the most popular species. So if you actually think about the crested gecko in the wild, even if it went extinct in the wild, the pet industry would be the lifeboat for that species, keeping it alive, which is kind of an interesting spin on keeping and breeding any type of a reptile. All right, so number 6 helps to keep people from taking ball pythons from the wild. I know a lot of people, a lot of times they'll actually take certain species from the wild, and you know, keeping and breeding ball pythons, it seems like we have so many ball pythons now. There's so many breeders producing so many. It's almost hard to believe that people still take ball pythons from the wild and bring them into the pet industry, although they actually do it, which kind of boggles my mind. It's like, why would you take one from the wild when you could just produce them yourself, and so many people produce them? And with a lot of species, you know, I think that the breeding in captivity really cuts down on the harvesting from the wild, because we can actually produce them in captivity versus taking them from the wild. Number 7, the thing I really like about ball pythons and breeding them is that there's unlimited combinations as far as the genes, and I think that's what really keeps the ball python industry alive. You can actually get into breeding any type of morph. There's like over 200 different genes, and we're adding to it all the time, and it seems like if you actually kind of work it into a calculator and figure out how many combinations we can make, it's almost unlimited, like millions and millions of combinations of genes. And if you actually notice that the reptile shows, when they open the door, everybody rushes in and rushes up to the ball python tables, because there's a lot of combinations that people have never seen before in their entire life that have been made for the very first time, and that really gets people's attention. So as far as breeding, I don't think, you know, it's like if you actually think about like breeding like llamas or, you know, stuff like that. I've actually had some llamas, and I know at one point they were really, really expensive, and then people just bred them to the point where they weren't worth anything at all. It's because there's only one type of llama versus ball pythons. There's like millions of different combinations that you can actually make with ball pythons. It's kind of crazy. It's almost like a living art form, which is pretty amazing. So number 8, the future is secure for breeders. So that is another thing. If you're actually getting into breeding ball pythons, maybe thinking about doing it as kind of for a living. You know, a lot of times when you're breeding animals, you're always thinking about some of the competition. For example, if you started breeding black labs or something like that, you know, a certain species of dog, and you get to the point where you kind of flood in the market, and then all of a sudden everybody around you is just flooding the market with all the similar types of dogs. It's completely different with ball pythons, and the thing that really keeps it alive is the new genes coming into the industry year after year. So every year it seems like I find several new genes that kind of pop up in ball pythons. I'm kind of thinking maybe the genetics is kind of unstable in ball pythons, and we get just these random mutations that are just spontaneously created. I've actually seen people breeding ball pythons together, and just out of the blue they make a new gene, and that gene is actually genetic, and then they prove it to be like dominant or co-dominant. Just kind of out of the blue we make a new gene, which is kind of crazy, and that is really what keeps the ball python industry alive. All right, so number 10, the reason I keep and breed ball pythons is because they live a really long time versus some of your other pets. So I actually saw, I don't know if you saw that news article, this was actually in a zoo where they had a ball python that was in the 60s. I think it was like 65 years old, which is kind of crazy that a ball python would live that long. So Bobby here around my neck is kind of choking me out. It's kind of hard to believe that this snake right here could potentially outlive me. That is one of the advantages of ball pythons. And I know if you're actually keeping dogs, probably one of the biggest things that is probably one of the biggest heartbreaks with dogs is that they don't live very long. You know, every 7 to 14 years, your dog passes away from old age. And a lot of people, you know, they go through dog after dog after dog and they all pass away from old age. And they get to the point where, you know, they just can't get another dog because of the pain associated with losing all of those pets, which is kind of crazy. As a matter of fact, if you actually look at dogs, they live pretty long versus some of your other animals. I was actually thinking maybe of getting into breeding pet mice or pet rats, which would be kind of an interesting thing to get into. But if you look at rats, they only have a lifespan of 2 years, maybe 3 years, if you're lucky. So if you're actually buying a pet rat, you'd only expect it to live a couple years. And then every couple of years, you're replacing the rat because it died of old age. And mice are even worse. Mice only live about a year, maybe 2 years, if you're really lucky with your mice. As a matter of fact, I'm breeding mice as a food source for my ball pythons. And kind of the weird thing about the mice is after 8 months, they pretty much get too old to reproduce, which is kind of crazy. They'd have a really super short lifespan. So for me to breed rats and mice, it'd be almost like, you know, I give someone a little bundle of joy that doesn't last very long, and in the end it's going to be a heartbreak because it doesn't really last that long. Versus if I give someone a ball python, I know pretty much for their whole life they can actually have that snake, and if they get tired of that snake, they could actually give it to someone else, or, you know, if they actually outlive the snake, or the snake outlives them, they can actually will it away, which is kind of crazy to think about. You know, Bobby could potentially live longer than me, and someone would get this when I pass away in about 30 or 40 years. He's actually 7 years old, so if they live, you know, 60 plus years, he could potentially live another 50 plus years, which is kind of crazy for a ball python. And that's one of the reasons that I really like ball pythons. So that is pretty much it. That is my top 10 list. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.